Right, we should start getting people coming in. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tariq Khawaja. I'm a Green Party activist, and I'm part of the Greens for Palestine steering group. Greens for Palestine is a group of Green Party members campaigning for the liberation of our Palestinian brothers and sisters, for justice, freedom, and dignity for the Palestinian people. Thank you to everyone joining us tonight for what is a crucial discussion: media complicity in genocide, journalism, power, and the manufacture of consent. We're living through an era where the violence being inflicted on Palestinians is not only carried out militarily and politically, but also enabled culturally, including through the media. Because mainstream media shapes public consciousness. It defines who is seen as human, whose suffering is worth naming, and whose deaths are quietly normalized. When we speak of genocide and the deliberate destruction of Palestinian people, misrepresentation is not neutral, and selective empathy is not neutral either. Tonight's webinar will examine the role of mainstream media in manufacturing consent for state violence, sanitizing or obscuring genocide and apartheid, and marginalizing the Palestinian resistance, solidarity, protest, and dissent. The event also takes place against an extremely urgent backdrop, one that's received near total mainstream media silence. Prisoners on remand have been on hunger strike for a total of 73 days, facing prolonged pretrial detention, denial of bail, suppression of communications with the outside world, and reports of severe medical neglect as their health became critical. So it's not just about media bias. It's about power, who has it, how it's maintained, and what it costs when institutions that claim neutrality actively contribute to injustice. The format for tonight is we're going to hear from 3 brilliant speakers. Each speaker will present for around 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open up into an audience Q&A. Please keep your questions thoughtful and focused, and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. So with all that said, let's get into it. It's a real honor to introduce our first speaker for this evening, Karishma Patel. Karishma is a former BBC journalist who made the principled decision to resign over the broadcaster's coverage of Gaza. In doing so, she helped expose something many of us have experienced and felt for years: that the framing of Palestinian life and death in the mainstream media is not accidental, it is political. Karishma brings invaluable insight into how editorial decisions are made up of inside major institutions, what pressure journalists face, and how narratives become shaped and enforced. Karishma, thank you for joining with us and being with us tonight. It's over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for joining this. For joining this basically on a weekday evening. It is incredibly important, especially right now when we're seeing less about the genocide in the media. It's incredibly important that we continue to talk about how the genocide has been covered, how Palestinians are treated in the media, also because those lessons are applicable in many different story areas. But it's Palestine that I think teaches us the most about how the media operates. So I'm going to begin by talking a bit about my story. Some of you might be familiar with it, others might not be. But essentially, I worked at the BBC for about 4.5 to 5 years. So I finished my master's and I started at the BBC, and it was my first job. And I came to the BBC very passionate about public service and about journalism. So I thought that the BBC might be a good home for me, perhaps naively. Now, while I was there, I was a producer, and then I was on air as a reporter, eventually as a newsreader, reading the news on Radio 5 on the BBC News channel. And then by the end of 2023, I became a sort of resident Middle East specialist, let's say, on my team. And that was also in part because I had done an internship at UNRWA a couple of years prior. And for those who don't know, UNRWA is the United Nations organization that operates in Palestine. So I found myself in a situation where, I mean, for me, my politics were always very clear, but I did have a really strong commitment to, as I said, to public service and to journalism. And, you know, it was very clear to me very quickly at the end of 2023 that the BBC was not really concerned with accurately reporting on this genocide. And when I say accurately, I mean accurately representing the scale, the gravity, the illegality, the disproportionality of Israel's actions in Gaza, because all of it is utterly overwhelming. The sorts of things that I've covered, the sorts of things that I've seen are incomprehensibly cruel. You know, they almost defy explanation. And I looked around and I realized that actually I was in a newsroom and I was within a newsroom culture that, you know, that was deeply, deeply troubling. There was, you know, at best a sort of unwillingness to cover the story properly. And at worst, you know, there were some people showing very clear biases in favor of Israel. And I'm going to talk a bit more about this newsroom culture and the different sorts of biases that do exist a bit later on. But essentially, it was the end of 2023, and I found myself in a position where I'd worked really hard to get to a certain point in my career, and my ethics came up against the place I was working in that I'd worked so hard to be in. And ultimately, I had to make a decision at that point. You know, did I want to just go along with what was going on around me, sort of accept it, or did I want to fight back, organize, become a sort of problem in that place, risk my career, but, you know, it's by the by, but ultimately do the right thing. And I chose to do the latter. It's never an easy thing, but I chose to do the latter. And that came after working on Gaza day in and day out for months and months on end, seeing some of the worst things I will ever see in my life. You know, trawling through different videos, reports from journalists on the ground in Palestine, every single day. So it became really clear to me very quickly that this was a genocide. We were watching crimes against humanity unfold. And then looking around at our public broadcaster, the coverage just wasn't reflecting that. And I think one of the reasons I feel it's so important to tell my story is because there was a moment where I decided that my career didn't matter as much as doing the right thing. And what that meant at the time was that actually, well, I looked around and frankly, in the media space, there wasn't that much. You know, there wasn't the sort of organizing infrastructure that does now exist. There weren't groups I could turn to. You know, the union wasn't being particularly strong on it. And I was in a position where at about 27 years old, you know, I'd done pretty well in my career, but I was still really junior. I ended up galvanizing people, bringing people together and just creating the mechanisms that didn't exist before me. And I mean, I think it's something a lot of people who have maybe recently joined the Green Party understand, but when you are confronted with, you know, such abysmal horror, and I think it's very important at that moment to look in the mirror and to say, what is it that I can do? What is it that I can sacrifice? What is it that I can contribute in this moment in order to do the right thing? And, you know, in this current moment where we are up against reform, a lot of people in the Green Party have decided that joining the party and getting politically involved is the thing to do. So back in 2023, I realized that the thing I had to do was to bring people together, to organize and try to fight for the coverage to be editorially for it to be editorially accurate, it's really all I was asking for. Because if you are to accurately communicate to the public what Israel's doing, it becomes very clear that it's a genocide, and it continues to be a genocide. Now, influence in a mainstream newsroom is really difficult to describe. And I've had a lot of people ask me why the coverage is the way it is, why it's so inaccurate on multiple levels, why it's so manipulative on multiple levels. And there are a lot of answers to that, but I would say that in some instances, yes, there were directives that came that were top down, that were, editorially unjustifiable, and that there are definitely people at the top of an organization like the BBC who are incredibly biased toward Israel. But it's also the case that a newsroom culture sort of festered and was created in which people started choosing the path of least resistance because they were afraid of complaint campaigns or of getting told off. And as journalists, as soon as we start being cowardly, essentially, we stop doing our jobs. And I was watching that happen around me. So there were different layers of bias, different layers of sort of, some people acting out of fear, some people acting out of, a very clear bias toward Israel. Either way, it is our job as journalists to follow the evidence and to get to the truth, no matter who's angered by that. And that, that has definitely been lost in terms of the coverage of the genocide. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about some of those key issues with the media coverage of Gaza. So, I mean, a lot of you will have noticed the headlines, the kind of framing in different articles, the framing when you watch, for example, the BBC News at 10. And I do want to just sort of run through a few of those things. So as I've said, mainstream media hasn't accurately reflected the scale, the gravity, disproportionality, illegality of Israel's actions in Gaza. And it's created what I what I call a sort of accountability hole across mainstream media's coverage. Now, this happens in a number of ways. And, there are also plenty of kind of media professors and media critics who have been speaking about different elements here. But I'm going to run through a few of them. So the lack of context is a really big one. So I noticed, from the very beginning, from the end of 2023, I noticed that there was little to no context about the world predating October the 7th. There was little to no context about what had happened to Palestinians, about the history of Palestine, about the Nakba, any of these things. And there were a lot of people who come to only BBC News for their news. And all of those people were misinformed, especially across time, because whatever context they don't read or see, they may never encounter, or they won't think is important. So this was a really crucial thing. Lots of context has been missed across now over 2 years. And that leads me on to the next thing, which is omission. So a lot of big stories across now, over 2 years have been missed. Now, I remember a moment, I believe this was in sort of early 2024, when a number of BBC journalists did bring up to executives, people high up at the BBC, did question why there was no big documentary about the videos Israeli soldiers were uploading to Instagram and to TikTok, videos of them blowing up residential homes, videos of them trying on Palestinian women's underwear. All of these videos existed. They were uploading them with their names and faces. And, the question was asked, where is our big documentary on this? And the truth is that there are so many massive investigations, massive documentaries missing. And that's created another sort of hole, a hole in public knowledge. There are plenty of people walking around today, and this terrifies me, who will never understand the extent of what's happened in this genocide, or who might in many years' time, because so many of the stories have been missed. and so much has been omitted over time. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is language. The sort of language that has been used around the genocide is something a lot of people have recognized. And ultimately, I think what we've seen is a sort of muddy, unspecific language when Palestinians are harmed by Israel that frees Israel from accountability. And that language often involves removing Israel as a perpetrator, not being very clear about who has done what. And that's allowing people to detach, because it creates a sort of blurry picture in their minds. They're not sure it's real. And it allows them to sort of detach their empathy. And then on the other side, the quote unquote other side, you've got a sort of very loaded, emotive, incredibly clear language used to talk about Israelis being harmed. And it is so emotive, it cuts through and it creates a really visceral, emotive response in our audiences. You have a very clear sense of perpetrator. You look at the language around October 7th, you are seeing words like atrocity and massacre. Those things stay with people. And you know, as I said, there are a lot of people who will only go to BBC News or Sky or, you know, these sort of mainstream media platforms for their news. And those are the things that are going to cut through. So that's creating a sort of empathy gap. You know, there are a lot of different sorts of gaps that mainstream media has created in terms of its coverage of the genocide. And then the last one that I'm going to talk about there is actually the editorial choices made in the newsroom around who we speak to. Now, there was a brilliant Centre for Media Monitoring report done last year, in the summer of last year, it came out. And it looks at the numbers, you know, the figures in terms of who was spoken to in BBC coverage. And honestly, it's shocking. They looked at over 35,000 pieces of BBC content and found Israeli deaths were given 33 times more coverage per fatality than Palestinian deaths. They found that Palestinian voices were muffled. So the BBC interviewed far fewer Palestinians than Israelis. I think it was double the number of Israelis, and sort of foregrounded their perspective 11 times more. So again, that's going to create a certain impression in the audience. They are going to feel that Israeli voices are sort of unduly important. And, you know, that actually reminds me really specifically of a moment at the end of 2023 when I was sat, I think, watching the news at 10, and they had interviewed a female relative of one of the Israelis taken hostage on October 7th. And she said something along the lines of, we should absolutely bomb everyone in Gaza. And there was no pushback. There was no pushback from the interviewer. There was no context that wasn't cut out. It was just left there to sit. And actually, when you have enough coverage of that nature, your audience is going to see Israeli grief and Israeli pain as exceptional. And therefore, to sort of see that pain as something that justifies an exceptional extrajudicial response, crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide. And that is what's happened over time. And again, that absolutely terrifies me. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you here are aware of the sort of political dangers of what mainstream media has done. I've spoken a little bit about creating a sort of empathy gap with audiences, but I think it's also the case that, I think it's important to think about what that empathy gap is doing, because actually, if you had a mainstream media that accurately covered the genocide, it might have been the case that more people went out into the streets. It might have been the case that more people chose to vote differently at the last election. It might have been the case that more people pushed the government to change its actions. There are lots of things that might have been the case, but it is the media's job to educate, audiences, and to give them a really clear sense of accountability, via all of its tools of investigation and all the rest of it. We need to be able to give the public that clear sense of who's to blame and what to ask for. Ultimately, we are that connective tissue in the democracy that we're in. And mainstream media has obviously been doing the opposite of that, and in fact sort of dampening our sense of empathy, dampening our sense of engagement, and therefore dampening our sense of engagement with democracy itself. I think I also just want to mention in terms of this as well, that mainstream media has been very good at demonizing and minimizing forms of dissent. Again, this is a core part of our democracy. It's our democratic right to go out and protest. And in fact, a lot of mainstream media has framed peaceful protests as potentially dangerous. They've hyper-focused as well on means of protest rather than on, exactly what is being protested against. We've seen that happen time and time again. We saw it with Glastonbury. We see it often. And again, this is part of the overall tactic, but it's part of what mainstream media is sort of doing overall in terms of allowing people to disengage. A lot of audiences are going to watch that sort of coverage and just see protesters as a nuisance rather than understanding why they might sacrifice so much, and what they sort of ethically stand for, but also what is at stake overall in terms of this genocide. So I'm going to round off now with maybe just a sense of what we can do next and what might be meaningful to do. Because I ended up spending about a year at the BBC organising, fighting for better coverage. And ultimately, I had to come face to face with the fact that a lot of people at the top of that organisation simply don't care about good journalism. That's not shocking to any of us, but I did try every available internal mechanism. And, I left the BBC and I came out, and there is this sort of flourishing independent media landscape now. It wasn't the case some years ago. It is getting stronger. It's getting bigger. There's more, there's more funding behind it. And actually, even as a BBC journalist, I recognise that turning to independent media was the best thing I could do around certain story areas to know what was going on. And so I left the BBC, and actually there was this entire journalistic landscape full of journalists, full of people who are actually willing to go the extra mile to find the truth. Declassified, for example, we're going to have Kennard here. It's a great example. They have done what our biggest news organizations should have done. Where is the big BBC documentary on RAF flights over Gaza? Where is that? That should have existed a long time ago. So one of the things I would say is, support independent media. Do what you can to support them, consume their content, donate if you can, whatever it is you can do, absolutely do it. It's important that the independent media landscape continues to grow. I have so many young journalists who come to me and they say, look, I'm in the last year of my journalism degree. I would have wanted to be you. I would have wanted to be in the kind of role you were in at the BBC. But now that I've heard what you have to say, now that I have seen the coverage of the genocide, I would never want to be there. Where should I go? And I would love to have more places to direct them to. I really would. And I think the left needs to build its own media space, and we need to be able to compete with a lot of far right media as well, which is a whole other conversation to have. I think it's also really important to support media organizations doing critical work. There are organizations started by really brilliant media professors, and they are looking to reform the entire industry. One of them is the Media Reform Coalition. They do brilliant work. Follow them, follow what they're doing. There's another organization. It's an Instagram page called News Cord. Again, go and follow them. Follow what they're doing. They are analyzing pieces of news coverage as they come out. They will help you make complaints about certain things. they are brilliant. And I think the last thing I can advise people to do is just to remain critical, remain vigilant themselves. I am actually not telling you necessarily to switch off from all mainstream media. I think it's useful to know what they're saying. And I think that in certain areas, sometimes depending on what it is, the coverage might be okay. But no matter what you're doing, no matter what news media you're consuming, stay critical, stay vigilant. If you're visiting a mainstream news website and you are looking at news coverage of something I'm going to call, something that they would see as controversial, but something that's a sort of live wire or a hot topic, I would advise you to question the language, question the framing, question what they've chosen to focus on, question which voices are being foregrounded, question what's in the headline and why it's there, question the very photographs in that article, because, as we all know, there is no such thing as impartiality. At least not in practice and not at the moment. Every decision that is made in a piece of news is made by a human being, and there are lots of small biases that can make their way in as well. And that's why I think that it's so important we have media literacy, and that actually the general public knows how to analyze news content so that they can decide for themselves if they feel that it's good news content. But I would also just advise looking at independent media as well as mainstream media, because I think that's the most useful thing to do. I'm going to round off there, but I really look forward to answering some of your questions. There are some really great things I can see in the chat, but I'll give the mic back to Tarek.
Thank you so much, Karishma. That was amazing. I'll head into introducing our next speaker. Our second speaker this evening is Harriet Williamson. Harriet is the commissioning editor and reporter at Novara Media, and her journalism has been at the forefront of challenging mainstream silence and distortion, including Palestinian resistance, genocide, and the crackdown on the solidarity movement in Britain. Harriet has also documented the stories of the hunger strikers, stories that many of us simply just would not know without independent journalism. She represents the kind of reporting that's absolutely essential when institutions fail, journalism rooted in solidarity, truth, and accountability. Harriet, thank you so much for being here, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much for that lovely intro. I thought I might cry and probably don't deserve it, but here we go. So I've been at Novara for about a year now, and I really do see it as the kind of place that is challenging those mainstream media narratives and the silence that is a big part of a lot of our legacy media landscape. I'm somebody who has kind of always wanted to be in journalism and has kind of struggled to get there. Just as a little sort of personal background on me, I come from like a place, and I went to kind of school, and I come from a kind of background that doesn't produce a lot of journalists. It doesn't produce a lot of people who get into elite careers, full stop. And I really struggled a lot in 10 years to sort of find my place within the media landscape. And in the summer of 2024, when I was sort of looking for a job again after redundancy, I applied for loads of stuff, and I got offered a job at the BBC in the news, in digital front page curation. And I ended up turning it down. And even though the Novara job hadn't come along at that point, I really couldn't be more grateful to my past self for that decision. And I've been able to cover Israel-Palestine, free speech and free expression in the UK, particularly when it comes to pro-Palestinian free speech, particularly as it relates to the pro-Israel lobby as well, and groups like UK Lawyers for Israel. I've been quite instrumental at Novara in covering the prescription of Palestine action, and that is things like the Defend Our Juries protests, the hunger strikers, the judicial review that we're still awaiting a verdict on. All these things sort of fall within my beat, along with other non-Israel Palestine topics. We are a quite tight-knit, small team of journalists, and I work across platforms, so written, video, some Novara Live type stuff. And we we work incredibly hard at what we do, and sometimes it feels like there is a huge appetite for this independent journalism, but not really the same funding behind it as you might get within the sort of right-wing ecosystem. It feels like if you want to make really right-wing content, there is a huge like billionaire-backed machinery behind you which can lift you up and give you an instant platform, and that just does not exist on the left. But in terms of mainstream media framing and obscuring genocide, apartheid and state violence, which is of course what we're here to talk about, Karishma very rightly mentioned the Centre for Media Monitoring report into BBC News coverage for 12 months of genocide from October 2023. And I reported on this for Novara at the time. And I think that out of all the things that Karishma picked up on, I would also like to mention that it showed that the BBC consistently shut down allegations of genocide, and that was in the first 12 months. And they also refused to report on genocidal statements from Israel's own leaders and politicians. And that is a huge omission in terms of journalism. These are stories that you'd think, like, I should be all over telling that. We know that Israeli deaths got 33 times more coverage, but what that tells us is that Israeli deaths have 33 times more value. And that is coming from our public broadcaster, who we should expect better on. And it is correct that there are lots of people who only get their news from the BBC, and they see the BBC as a curation tool. So if it's not on the BBC, is it true and is it worth saying? I think a lot of anger around the BBC's coverage of the genocide comes from the way they obscured responsibility for things like war crimes with the use of passive language, something that they were found not to do in comparison to how Russia was covered during the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. The lack of context in BBC articles when it comes to the genocide in Gaza is really, really important to touch on. I'm just going to do it again because 40% of online articles mentioned October 7th when they talked about Israel and Gaza, but only 0.5% made any reference to context in terms of occupation and violence in Gaza in the days, weeks, and decades before October 7th. I think that's a glaring omission. Another one that I've deep dived into for Novara is the lack of mentioning of doctrines, like really specific military strategies like the Dyer Doctrine and the Hannibal Directive. And I did lots of work on this. It's also in video form if you don't fancy doing the whole long read. But when I went to the BBC for a right of reply on this, they were like, yeah, but we do cover them. And they sent me two specific examples, and one was from 2015 and one was from 2016. And yeah, the whole point was that they hadn't made a single mention of those two really important strategies since October 7th, 2023. And another reason why that's so important is because they provide the key to understanding Israel's actions and the genocide in Gaza. So saying that we covered it in 2015 and 2016 once each is really not good enough. The Dyer Doctrine is about the disproportionate use of force and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. If you look at what's happened in Gaza with it being totally fucking flattened, that's vital. And the Hannibal Directive, the fact that the BBC never mentioned that after October 7th, actually denies their audience the most crucial context, and not just context, but like understanding of what happened. You can't be giving your audience accurate and fair information if you don't mention this directive, which means that the Israeli military will use disproportionate force to kill their own soldiers rather than let them be captured. And that Israeli military officials confirmed to Israeli press after October 7th that it was a mass Hannibal event. Not mentioned, not on the BBC. And I don't want to feel like I'm being overly unfair to the BBC here. There's plenty of other mainstream media outlets, right, that we can attribute great responsibility for poor reporting on the genocide and on Israel and Palestine more generally since October 2023. But the BBC holds like this very specific place in British society, doesn't it? It's important to us. It is our public broadcaster. A lot of us pay towards its journalism. They pay a license fee. And then to have that public broadcaster cover 60% of deaths of journalists in Ukraine versus 6% in Gaza, when Gaza is the deadliest place on earth to be a journalist. It just seems like you're not honouring your audience, and you're not doing proper journalism to actually serve them. I've worked in quite a few newsrooms over my career, ranging from very right-wing to more sort of melty-centrist. And as my mate from who I used to work with at the Independent, Charlotte, always says to me, she says, centrists are just right-wingers who are embarrassed. And I think she's probably right. But the bigger your newsroom is, and I know this from experience, the more there is a culture of sort of groupthink, essentially. And even if you have really strong figures at the top who are saying, no, don't do this, you cannot write this story, you cannot mention these words, after a while, a sense of enforcement actually becomes unnecessary, because people within the organisation, particularly junior people or like middle management, they start policing themselves, and they're like, okay, this is not worth it. Okay, that person doesn't like this, or okay, I'm just not prepared to have that conversation. And the speed at which things have to happen, it deprioritizes truth seeking and difficult conversations. And I think there's also a reality that we don't talk about in terms of the press, and it's that these jobs, I would say particularly BBC jobs, they're so highly prized and sought after, and they are like they're an amazing employer. You could stay there your whole life, you'd be promoted, you'd be looked after. And basically any job in journalism, there's going to be like 150 people waiting outside the door, ready and willing to take your job off you and do it for less money, if it comes down to it. And I think that understandably makes people fearful, and it makes people unwilling to stand up for what they believe in. I feel incredibly privileged to be with the employer that I'm currently with. I can't speak more highly of the journalism that Novara has done outside of myself. Don't want to just blow my own trumpet here, but I genuinely do think that it's an independent media company that's really worth supporting. I jumped ahead, I was meant to say that at the end. Anyway, I will just go back to like the political consequences of things like selective empathy and strategic silence, and all those things that you get when, you know, you are presenting this narrative that Israeli lives are really valuable and Palestinian lives are nowhere. It's essentially about who gets to be human in these situations, who is allowed to speak. It's like the BBC constantly pressing guests to condemn Hamas. No one gets asked to condemn Israel. No one gets asked to condemn Israeli war crimes. The double standard is so glaring that it feels like you're listening to this and you're like, am I going mad? We've all seen on our phones a live stream genocide. We've seen the most horrendous things, like half of children hanging from buildings. Like, you can't unsee that stuff. And then it feels like we're being constantly gaslit by these legacy providers of our news. And then we're like wondering and debating, oh, why do people just get their news off social media now? Why don't they trust the BBC? Well, this has got something to do with it. When it comes to things like protest, why do we think that so many news outlets were able to get away with calling pro-Palestine protesters who attended solidarity marches in London, they get to call it hate marches, they get to make it small, like a fringe movement, the presence of anti-Zionist Jews, who are always there, by the way, there's always a massive Jewish bloc, they're constantly obscured. They might as well not exist when it comes to mainstream media coverage. I'm talking about all the big papers there, like they all should take responsibility for that. The consequences are it's making it feel fringe in people's minds, and it gets linked with like crusty activism or even like dangerous. These people are terrorists. They want to harm the police. They want to like cause trouble. They want to stop you going about your shopping in central London on a Saturday. I feel like the perception that's being fostered is that these things are not safe, they're not inclusive, and it's not quote unquote normal people who would want to take part, when actually, if you've been on any March for Palestine, you'll know that you're marching alongside people of all ages, races, genders, walks of life, people who are very much not like you, families, people who are like you would definitely go for a pint with. And I think that's why that's one of the reasons it's been so important for Novara to actively challenge some of these perceptions with our coverage of protest. And we've done a lot of work around covering protests on the prescription of Palestine Action, which is now obviously a prescribed group under UK terror law. And that means that being a member of it or expressing support of it is punishable by up to 14 years in prison. And we've done a great deal of work around covering the hunger strike as well. There is currently still one Palestine Action linked remand prisoner continuing their hunger strike. That's Umar Khalid. He's restarted his as of 10th of January. All the rest of them are on pause and currently refeeding. There is incredible power in independent journalism, in solidarity media, and in grassroots communication, right? That's why it threatens big outlets, and why you sense there is this sort of snobbery from people who work for legacy publications towards those who have maybe chosen a different path. But I think that in the age of everybody being able to make content, and the evils of big tech aside, platforms giving a certain sense of sort of democracy and like anyone can be heard, until of course they get demonetized and shadow banned or whatever. But you know, there are pros and cons to these things. In some ways, this is the most sorry, I put a timer on to make sure I didn't go over. I think that this is one of the best times to be somebody who is conducting independent journalism and reporting and like not being afraid. Yeah, I guess I'll wrap up there, but very happy to take questions. I'm really grateful to have been asked to speak today. Yeah, and please support Novara Media.
Thank you so much, Harriet. That was great. And it was so interesting to hear your perspective and the amazing work that Novara Media has been doing. Thank you so much. I'll introduce our third and final speaker now. Our third speaker tonight is Matt Kennard. Matt is an investigative journalist and author who also co-founded Declassified UK, one of the most important independent outlets challenging state secrecy and foreign policy propaganda in this country. Matt is the author of The Racket, A Rogue Reporter versus the Masters of the Universe, and Irregular Army, How the US Military Recruited Neo-Nazis, Gang Members, and Criminals to Fight the War on Terror. He has done incredible work tracking RAF surveillance flights over Gaza during the genocide. His work is especially vital for this discussion because it exposes how state power functions and how the media institutions often operate as part of the ecosystem that sustains empire, war, and repression. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is now yours.
Hello. I couldn't hear Tarek's introduction, but I heard Harriet and Karishma. I hope you can hear me now. Sorry, I'm in the car due to a mix-up. But I'm very happy to talk today because I think the Green Party is a very, very important institution now within the UK. Because I mean, I think it's fair to call it a mainstream party now under Zach Polanski, and it's the only mainstream party which is anti-genocide. Which is, I mean, the Lib Dems to a degree, but they're very lily-livered, and the Green Party have been good pre-Zach Polanski from the beginning of the genocide. It was noticed by a lot of activists that they called for an arms embargo early on. They called for Israel to not be included in sports events. And the other point is when a party like the Greens gets increasingly popular and gets closer to power, the pressures on the leadership to take the Zionist line are going to get more and more acute. So it's vital that grassroots groups within the Greens keep the pressure on the leadership, because it's nothing to do with them personally or their personal politics, but there's just the way that the system works is to co-opt and to particularly on Palestine. Palestine is, and you see that kind of with Zoran Mandani in New York. He's already kind of he refused to sack a Zionist that was a high-level Zionist that was already working within the previous administration, and he said a couple of things that are a bit iffy. But the point is, they have to. If you have a Democratic Party, which the Greens are, they have to react to members, and I think members are very much on the pro-Palestine side. So it's I'm very honoured to be here tonight. But on the issue at hand, which is the genocide and the media, I mean, firstly, I mean, there's two ways that the media are complicit in this genocide. One is just outright reproducing lies, which created the conditions and the discourse which allowed the genocide to happen. And I'm talking the specifics. Obviously, you could run through a whole litany of them, but the famous ones were like 40 beheaded babies, babies cooked in ovens, all sorts of absolute atrocity propaganda, which is absurd, but is very, very sinister, because it's easy in the bubbles that we live in on Twitter and in independent media to think that we're getting information that everyone else is getting. But sometimes you talk to a normal person who consumes the mainstream media, and it's shocking how much of this stuff is imbibed. And that's why it works. Propaganda works, especially with the mass media, because although the independent media is very important, as Harriet and Karishma outlined, our reach is restricted. And that's the way that the powers that be want to keep it. And when you're talking about mass media, the same pressures come on them as I talked about come on political parties when they're reaching a mass audience. They get increasing amounts of flack from the Israel lobby, from advertisers, from all sorts of different interests. So there's the conditions are there for them to reproduce that propaganda faithfully, and they always do in the case of Israel, and often on pretty much every issue, to be honest. If you look at Venezuela recently and Iran, it's the same dynamics. But I actually think that a more potent form of propaganda is what was one mentioned by Harriet, which she calls strategic silence. I'd call it that as well, but I'd also call it propaganda by omission. And having worked in the mainstream media for the Financial Times and for the Guardian for a while, and then worked in independent media for much longer outside, and it's particularly my experience at Declassified UK, I just believe that propaganda by omission is the main way that they brainwash the population. Because one of the things, when you have a media like we do, which has places like the BBC and the Guardian and the Independent, they don't publish often, although they do, like I mentioned, in particular moments, publish outright lies. And actually, that's a very, very unsophisticated form of propaganda, because people it can be exposed. A much more potent form of propaganda is just to leave out all the information you need to have a tolerable understanding of how the world works, and leave out all the information to have a tolerable understanding of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And you see that again and again and again over the last 2 years. It's been particularly clear this last 2 years, but it's obviously operated for a long time. But I mean, in the case of the RAF spy flights, which Karishma mentioned, this is a story I've been working on for 2 years. And basically, with the work I was doing at Declassified and Declassified have continued doing, without that, that story would not be in the public realm at all. And you're talking about, we were a small organization. It's bigger now, but I think we were 4 people for most of the period of the genocide. And if you think about the resources of the BBC, the Guardian, and the rest of the media, we're talking about thousands of journalists. Imagine if the BBC had the same bent or the same idea about journalism as Declassified UK, the system would change very quickly, which is why the BBC is not allowed to have that, because the whole system runs on propaganda. The whole system runs on myths that are propagated to justify the system that we live in and to justify the genocide. So that's why I believe they're complicit, and that's why I think that the propaganda by omission is such a beautiful way to do it, because it also is a very effective way of making journalists think that they're independent within the mainstream media, because they're not asked to tell outright lies. But what Harriet mentioned about groupthink is very pervasive, and it just means that you don't think certain things. George Orwell said this in his foreword to Animal Farm. He said in England, the propaganda works by people knowing what it wouldn't do to say. implicitly. So they're not told. When I was at the Financial Times, I was never told I couldn't say X, Y, Z. But after working there for a couple of years, you just stop thinking certain things. You stop including the context which exposes the powerful forces. And the overriding principle, I think, is that anything that's not conducive to power just doesn't exist. So a very clear example in the Financial Times was, I remember when I was writing about Hosni Mubarak, who was the dictator in Egypt who was overthrown in 2011. I was working at the FT then. I wouldn't be, I couldn't write US-backed Egyptian dictator, right? But if I was writing about Hezbollah, I'd always be told to write Iranian-backed militant Lebanese group. Now, both those things are true, but yet one you're allowed to write and everyone will just unthinkingly write. The other one is completely jarring if you're working with the NFT. A US-backed dictator, I can't write that. And no one's told them to say that. It's just the way that you're culturalized and you become part of the group think. This is why I think that journalists, mainstream journalists, are so shocked when they're told about the spy flights, because it's like, well, either they say, well, this didn't happen, and then if someone says, well, it's been reported on heavily, and there were over 600 of them, and millions of pounds were spent on Britain to participate, they like, well, we didn't have access to that information, and then my answer would be, well, did you look? Because you can find it on flight tracking websites. It's not exactly rocket science, but I genuinely think they think they're good journalists, and they think that they're adversarial to power. But the reality is that if they practice journalism like that, they'd be out of a job very soon, and that's the way the system works to reproduce itself. But thankfully for the internet, the world is different now. Like Novara couldn't exist, Declassified couldn't exist, Canary. There's a lot of double down news without the internet now. It does give us a way to circumvent the legacy institutions, and they hate it, and that's why so many legacy journalists hate Twitter, because they've literally spent centuries sitting on the top of society as these respected and vaunted intellectuals who pontificate on how the world works, and they've never really had any pushback because there was no mechanism to push back, and there was definitely no mechanism to diffuse information on a mass scale outside of newspapers. And now that's not the case. And the reality is that these people aren't in the position they are because they're the most clever or the most astute observers of society. What they are is they're the ones who are most keen to accept the presuppositions of the state and corporate power that reigns in our society. And that's it's quite a revelation for a young person. I remember I started understanding this at the FT, and I was like, all the people I've been told to respect as the most intelligent and the most clever and the best observers, they're not there on merit because of they've got particularly innovative thought. They're there because they accepted the parameters of the debate that they're handed when they go to their private school and then go on to Oxford and Cambridge, and that's the way the world works. But I would say that I'll reiterate what's been said, which is that everyone should support independent media, because there's a debate about whether you go into these institutions and change them from the inside because you get good people. But I actually think that that's a waste of time. Karishma had to leave the BBC. There's many other journalists that have left legacy institutions because those institutions are set up to justify and reproduce state propaganda. That's why they're allowed to operate on a mass scale. So the idea that we can go in and completely change that structural basis is, I just don't believe. I think what we should all focus on is creating an alternative, like a parallel infrastructure that has the resources and the personnel to really reveal truth and get it out there. And it's happening. It's been happening for long decades now. Even WikiLeaks started. Well, their big revelation started in 2010, and that completely transformed journalism and our understanding of how the world works. So I think that we all need to focus on supporting independent media, being independent journalists, because the other thing about these legacy mainstream journalists is they like to put themselves up on a pedestal and project the image that what they do is really difficult and taxing on the brain, but it's actually not. Journalism, most of the best journalism I get now is from Twitter. and it's from people on the ground. Look at the people in Gaza. Most of those people have never had any training. There's an amazing journalist called Abu Bakr Abed, who everyone should check out. He was in Gaza for a year and a half during the genocide and is now living in Dublin. But he had no formal training. In fact, he was a sports journalist. He was a football journalist. And he became an accidental war reporter and basically did some of the best writing and war reporting I've ever seen. Definitely better than all the BBC journalists stuck together. And that's because it's not rocket science, and also the talent doesn't rise to the top in journalism. So I think that we need when I say a parallel infrastructure, what I mean is an actual infrastructure, because one of the ways the system works to stop uncomfortable truths or stories that aren't conducive to power coming out is that independent media is marginalized, and all the incentives for independent media outlets is to become part of the mainstream. And also young reporters who come out of journalism school or come out of anywhere, who have an idealistic idea about journalism and want to do proper journalism, there's not really anywhere for them to go. As Harriet mentioned, like, she didn't know where to go. I didn't really know where to go when I left journalism school. And that's how they get you, because most people want to get a mortgage, they want to get a house, they want to have kids. And the reality is, and it's still the case, if you want to do independent journalism, it's still messy. There's not the kind of pathway to becoming a professional, and that will be the game changer. When people don't have to sell themselves out or become part of the system to actually live a normal life, that's when things will really start changing. I think that's happening. The obvious problem for that is funding. The state and the corporations have all the money, but in my opinion, if we had a proper trade union movement, the trade unions would start funding media, because obviously that's the main sort of independent and worker-based organizations in our society, and they fund to the tune of tens of millions the Labour Party every year, but they don't fund any independent media. Why? They really need to change that. But I think that I'll just finish with this. I think that the genocide in Gaza has changed everything. Not just in the media, but particularly the media. You know, everything I've talked about, none of it's new. All the propaganda techniques have been around since dot, but they've been very, very well choreographed and well constructed to make it pretty much invisible to normal people. But that is no longer the case. Gaza has completely exposed the propaganda system, because we have social media and we have all these amazing journalists in Gaza who have documented the genocide, and people have accessed that. Millions of people, maybe even billions of people have accessed the information that's coming out of Gaza, and they're cross-referencing that with the legacy institutions that they're told are the purveyors of top quality journalism, like the Times or the Guardian, and they're saying, well, I'm getting a full story here, I'm not getting the full truth. So, and they're starting to question the legacy institutions, and I don't think that's a realization and an awakening that will go away very quickly. And in fact, I think it's our job to use that momentum and use that awakening from a mass level of people, and really push on to say, well, yeah, the media is we don't have a media. That's the bottom line. We don't have a media. What we have is a propaganda system. And we have an alternative media which is marginalized and can't reach a mass audience in the same way, which is actually the ones telling the truth. And the genocide exposed that. The spy flights exposed that probably in a single story, because when you're talking about the spy flights, and they were a bit referenced in the summer. In September, because we did a story on Palestine Deep Dive, actually, which was about, we finally saw what the spy flights were doing over Gaza before the transponder had always been turned off, but they made a mistake. Anyway, that led to the Times covering it and the Guardian for the first time. But you're talking about clear participation in genocide, because the intelligence being collected over Gaza was being handed in real time to the Israeli military. And so you're talking about your government being participants in a genocide. It doesn't get more serious than that. And yet the whole media ignored it, completely ignored it. So that is, I mean, it's astonishing, but it's also extremely revealing. And I think that they're exposed, and hopefully the legacy institutions are dying now. And long may that death continue, to be honest, because I'll just finish with this. I've got one more point. When they did cover the spy flight story, they always also framed it from the government as how the government framed it. So when it was covered, which was not very much, they'd always said, well, it's for hostage rescue. And that was never interrogated by the media. And any proper journalist would be like, well, this is what the government's telling me. Obviously, the government's going to tell me what they think's good for the government rather than the truth. But no one interrogated that, even when they started covering it after that spy flight over Gaza was revealed. And that's the way that it works. The pipeline is the government releases a statement, or a think tank funded by the government releases a statement. It's loyally reproduced by the media. The media doesn't say that the think tank is funded by the government, and then it becomes common sense. So that system has ruptured now, and we need to rip open that rupture even more and replace it with independent organizations like Novara, Declassified, Kennard, and hopefully there'll be more coming up.
Thank you so much, Matt. I loved those points that you made about unions to fund the media and the important and vital work of journalists on the ground. We're now going to transition into our Q&A with the audience. So I want to thank all three speakers for those incredibly powerful contributions. So if you could please post your questions in the chat, and if you can, keep them brief. And note if it's directed to a specific speaker or to all speakers, though obviously if speakers want to, they're more than welcome to collectively come in whenever's relevant. So yes, I'll just please send your questions in the chat, and I'll scroll through and see if I can find ones from previously. Okay, let's see quickly. Okay, here we go. Hi, Karishma. Was there a discussion behind the scenes about what context should be provided for the history of Israel-Palestine? Was there a push to discuss the history of the occupation and so forth?
I mean, there were definitely people inside, myself included, who were pushing for more context to be included. You know, especially context around the Nakba. You know, you could do a search right now on the BBC website of all of its articles, and you'll find it's barely mentioned anywhere, which, you know, is absolutely absurd. So there were a number of us who were, you know, essentially fighting for it, along with other bits of editorial change. Unfortunately, I don't remember, you know, a proper editorial discussion happening where, you know, all of the journalists who are experts in this area was sort of asked what sort of context would be appropriate in terms of covering this story area. And in fact, what I saw around me actually was a really shocking lack of knowledge around the history of Palestine altogether. I mean, to paint a bit of a picture, a lot of the time in these newsrooms, you have generalists, so people who are jumping from one big story area to another, and they are, you know, day-to-day reporters, producers, whatever it is. And it is your job to educate yourself on something really big that's happening and to become a bit of an expert. I already knew plenty for other reasons, but it's everyone's job to do that. And sadly, that didn't happen. So a lot of people didn't even know what sort of context they should be fighting to have in the coverage. So yeah, there was absolutely a push internally. It didn't come from the top or from where it should have come from.
Perfect, thank you. The next one I have is for Matt. So I just want to check. Can you hear me now, Matt? Because I know we've had.
I can. Thank you. Yeah, no, all good.
Perfect. No problem. So the next question we've got is, the question is, how can union money fund an even more effective outlet than the Morning Star? Do we need more union funding for the Morning Star, or take it to a new level?
Well, I think the Morning Star performs a role, but it's not a whole ecosystem in itself. I'm talking about them funding a whole ecosystem and making an infrastructure, as I mentioned, that actually can take on the mainstream. Because there's not, if you look at society, right, when we, as journalists, we are meant to expose and reveal truths about how power operates. Now, power in our society is held by mainly two power centers, the state and the corporation. And they have all the money and all the power. The only alternative source of funding, or the only alternative power center, which obviously is not as powerful as the other two, but is organised labour. So yes, Morning Star, they can fund that, but they should fund way more than that, and actually create TV channels. And you could, I mean, they have millions of pounds. They could completely change the game. I mean, for a start, they should stop funding the Labour Party because they are funding genocide. And this is a point that's never made. And I got in trouble for this because I've been to millions of Gaza meetings and really good speeches by trade union representatives. And I'm always like, what is your union funding the Labour Party? And they're like, after talking about how bad the genocide is, like, yeah. And then it's like, well, do you not understand then that they're the government that is sending the spy flights, that's giving actual like material intelligence to the Israelis to kill kids and all the rest of it? And for some people, it just doesn't register in their minds. So the point about the unions is that the unions should be an independent power centre, and they are in some places and in some unions. But in the UK, pretty much all of them are co-opted by the system itself and have become part of it. And a major function of that is their relationship with the Labour Party. And they don't see themselves as actually a force for actually transforming society, which is obviously what they should be about. So I think that we need to, everyone should obviously join a union, but I think more important than that is when you join a union is to make it responsive to members and make it independent of powerful forces. So it's whether it's the perfect model or the best model, it doesn't really matter to me. It's the only model that can actually get the funding that we need. Because I don't think independent media should go after corporate money. I don't think it definitely shouldn't go after state money. So in that context, how are you going to build something really big? And there's only one option. So whether you like it or not, or think there's other problems, well, I think that's the best way to go. But it doesn't seem to be happening in this country. It happens a lot, by the way, in the global south. I've been to Bolivia a bunch of times, and I went to interview Evo Morales in the Amazon, and I was hanging out with him and the unions, because he's part of the unions, and they fund loads of local radio stations in the middle of the jungle in Bolivia, and all the workers go in and do radio programs and stuff, and it was amazing. And he said to me, the biggest problem that we have, progressives in the world and the left, is that the businesses and the establishment and the oligarchy own the media, because they can lie about me the whole time and it's effective. So they're aware that they need to create alternative institutions, and they're using union money to do it. They're using worker money to do it. So we should learn from them.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. The next question is going to be directed at all speakers, and I'll start with Harriet and then we'll open it up to everybody. So the question is, what's a good entry point to inform people / help them identify media biases? So this is open to everybody. We'll start with Harriet.
Okay, so the first thing I do is identify 4 or 5 or 3 or 4 independent news outlets that you want to follow. Say it's Novara, Declassified, Dropsite News, Zeteo in the US. Take a handful, keep reading and watching like a nice spread of legacy mainstream coverage, and compare it, and make sure you're going from both sources and you're looking at what's getting left out, how stories are framed, which stories are being told, who's getting humanized, who's allowed to speak, whose lives really matter. I think that's a really good way to educate yourself in terms of media literacy. And I think that as journalists who are independent and who are horrified by what the mainstream media has done over Gaza, but not just over Gaza, the way, media in this country serves as like a handshake to power, and it doesn't hold power to account. It just like props up and supports power. I think we have a duty to give you a bit of a look behind the scenes and tell you what these editorial processes are like, how, you know, even if you go into these newsrooms with the best intentions in the world in terms of like making things better, if you're quite a junior person, you're more likely to either just throw up your hands and give up and sort of stay there with your head down, or leave in a like a not great way, having burnt some bridges and not have a great reference to go on to your next job, or just leave the business entirely. Honestly, these are not workplaces where people who are junior, people who don't have a lot of personal power within themselves in terms of their seniority or like their clout or whatever, they're not places where these people can affect massive positive change, unfortunately. And I feel like that sounds quite downbeat, but even when I was at the Independent, the way things were covered, and this was like way pre-genocide, we're talking about things like the death of Queen Elizabeth and Jeremy Corbyn post him stepping down as leader of the Labour Party. There were lines and you didn't cross them. It was okay to say that Jeremy Corbyn was an anti-Semite, but it was not okay to say that his leadership was popular or he had any good ideas for this country. Like they existed as, Matt can probably speak to this better, but like these are almost like immutable truths, and if you go against them, people are like looking at you strangely all the time. And I saw someone ask in the chat, they were like, you know, the news agents left the BBC, why don't they report accurately now, even outside of things like personal biases? I think the number one answer to that question is something about access and not being allowed into the same circles, not having the same access to politicians if you say things that they don't like, not having powerful friends who no longer want to have you around. All this stuff like works together to create a sense that you're either in the club or you're out of it.
Thank you so much. I'll move to other speakers if anyone would like to come in. Karishma, Matt, would you like to come in and add anything to that question?
I mean, Harriet's answer was great. The only other thing I would say, I mean, I mentioned it already when I was speaking. Everybody here, if you don't follow News Cord, go and follow News Cord because it will show you how to do media analysis, media critique. It breaks it down really well. And I think it's a really accessible resource. It's literally News Cord, but CORD_org on Instagram. So go and follow them because it's incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, to what Harriet said. I think a very, very important part of it is when you're reading media, think about what they're not telling you rather than what they're telling you. And there's now many, many places you can cross-reference what you're seeing in The Guardian or The Times, wherever it is, with journalists on the ground. That's the beauty of Twitter, particularly. So do that. As Harriet said, look at certain websites. And also look at what stories are promoted, because another major propaganda technique is what's sometimes called distraction, which is to accentuate and promote certain stories which are conducive to power because they're scandalous, but they don't tell you anything about the real serious crimes being done or how the system works. And a good example of that in our society is Zach Polanski with his relationship with the media or his treatment in the media. If you look at, for a while, I don't know if it's still going on, but he was just every interviewer was obsessed with him and his position on trans rights, which is an important issue, but it's not the most important issue. And but he'd been very forceful and outspoken on the genocide in Gaza. He was barely ever asked about that. And what that does is to move the debate away from issues which really reveal the crimes of the state and reveal the genocidal crimes of the state, and move them onto these social issues which create the image of a really vibrant debate, because people have really strong opinions on these subjects, but they don't tell you anything about underneath what's going on underneath. And I mean, this happens all the time. If you look at what stories get promoted, the scandalous stories about Boris Johnson or whatever it is. They often, I mean, so I'll just finish with this. I remember during the leadership election where I can't remember if it was Rishi Sunak who won it, but anyway, it was around 2019. It might have been. Yeah, it might have been Rishi Sunak. Anyway, I was doing a lot of work on the UK role in Yemen at the time, which was similar to the UK role in Gaza in the sense that it was like material participation. We had 5 people inside the Saudi Air Operations Command while they were literally bombing everything in Yemen, schools, hospitals, prisons, created and blockading the country that was at the time was the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, with millions of kids on the brink of starvation, and we were intimately involved. And I remember when they were having the debates for the Tory leadership, there were 5 people in this debate, and I was just watching it, and all the questions were just like, just you can imagine the bullshit that they were coming out with, and not anyone. And obviously this wasn't surprising to me, but it is kind of amazing. Not anyone mentioned that all those 5 people, or 3 or 4 of them, because they were in ministerial roles at the Ministry of Defence or the Foreign Office, had been involved and participating and ordering participation in this, one of the most horrific crimes of the 21st century. And that's how it works. So anyone watching it who isn't aware or doesn't read alternative media, which is most people, watches that and thinks, well, I live in a great democratic society where the 5 candidates have to be questioned about all the important things they've done and all the important things they think. And yet you leave out this major crime. And that's a very, very good way of creating an illusion about society, about the society you live in, and the role that Britain plays in the world. And that's one specific example, but it operates across the board. So I just say directly to that question is, look what stories are being promoted and which ones are being suppressed. And that's a very good window into what they don't want you to know about.
On that, there's another question that's been asked. I'm going to put this up on the screen briefly, and then I'm going to take it away because it's quite a big block of text. I don't want to cover anybody's faces. So this question is, my only question is how any of the speakers think that framing Gaza as less important than Ukraine is part of the establishment's idea of who is considered like us versus them in the context of post-imperialism and devaluing in general of non-English speakers. I noticed that for decades that any natural disaster, etc., was always framed as X hundred of people died, including 2 Brits and an American, as if those lives meant more than all other casualties, i.e. white lives matter more. Who would like to come forward for that first question?
Oh, I feel like any of us could. I will say that so while I was at the BBC, I worked quite extensively on Ukraine as well as Gaza. So I sort of witnessed my newsroom covering both of these story areas and covering them drastically differently. So with Ukraine, there was this sort of outpour of grief. People were allowed to show emotion, and then their roles were not questioned, or their ability to cover the story was not questioned. And I think at a certain point, there was even some sort of charity drive for people from Ukraine, and I think that was perfectly fine. And then you compare that to Gaza and the fact that, you know, for example, me doing my job very well meant that my ability to be a journalist was questioned, and they were sort of like, "Are you too close to this story?" And I was sort of like, "I'm just covering this story properly," which requires a lot of focus and you know, a lot of attention to detail. It was very clear to me that there is a hierarchy of lives and that it's incredibly racialized. And, you know, obviously a lot of the journalists in these newsrooms are going to say, I'm not a racist. But what I definitely saw was, I mean, it's ultimately a willingness to humanize people from Ukraine and an unwillingness to humanize people from Palestine. And it was incredibly stark, especially in terms of the language being used, because they wouldn't even use language that was clear about the fact that Israel was killing Palestinians. And if you compare that to all of the headlines about Russia, you've got this kind of clarity around exactly what Russia's done to, you know, to a number of Ukrainians, and there's no, you know, they don't want to blur that. They don't want you to feel, they don't want a lack of clarity around that, essentially. So yeah, that was very clear to me, and I worked on them sort of back to back, so I can certainly say so.
Perfect. Thank you, Karishma. I'll open that up to the other speakers. Matt, Harriet, would you like to come forward with anything else you'd like to add to that question?
I think there absolutely is a hierarchy in terms of which lives are valued more in newsrooms and in coverage. You can even see it in terms of like the fundraisers that some organisations ran for Ukraine. And yeah, particularly things like headlines, when there is the passive voice used, like no news outlet in the UK seems to have any problem in placing the responsibility for attacks squarely on Russia and making that very clear in the headlines. And yet when it comes to Israel, it's like, oh, who could possibly have bombed that hospital? We do not know from the headline. And yeah, you don't see the BBC going to like the Russian military for comment, but anything that Israel is said to have done, it has to be framed around the IDF's denial, the IDF's version of events, in a way that just, you know, the double standard is so glaring, as I said in my bit of the talk a bit earlier. And yeah, this is who we feel, who we're like made to feel that we can relate to. And it's like, okay, it's white people from Ukraine, but when it's brown people in Palestine, it's like, oh, maybe they're terrorists, like maybe they're Hamas, maybe they all deserved it. I just feel like this is the line that is constantly being pushed, and it devalues human life. And then when we see like on our phone screens and stuff, and we see Palestinian children and women and men, civilians being like wiped out in a genocide, if you feel a level of humanity towards them, like for so long when I wasn't at Novara, when this had first started in October 2023, I genuinely felt a lot of the time like I was going mad. It's like, am I the only person feeling this terrible like dissonance and pain? And then like when you do any activism or you turn up for a march, you're like, actually, I'm not the only person. And that's incredibly important. But it's not just the media that has this sort of double standard in terms of which lives are valued. When I've covered things like free speech, pro-Palestinian free speech within the NHS, what we hear a lot from NHS employees is that, oh, my trust encouraged us to raise money for Ukraine, encouraged us to grieve or wear pins with the Ukrainian flag. But when it comes to Palestine, wearing a Palestinian flag is deemed unprofessional, or UK lawyers for Israel have made a complaint and said that you need to change your trust uniform policy so you can't wear a watermelon symbol or a flag of Palestine on your lanyard or have one in your office, because it's seen as dangerous or overly politicized, where Ukraine is apparently not political at all.
I'll hand over to Matt.
Yeah, I think that I've got a little bit of a different take on this. I mean, obviously there is the element of on a society, but I think that actually the main reason is power projection. You know, if the Ukrainians hadn't been invaded by Russia, but been invaded by a UK ally, they wouldn't be getting the sympathy they're getting. If Gaza had been invaded by a UK enemy, it wouldn't be covered in the same way. So obviously race plays a role, but I think it's also just where do you stand in terms of the ability of NATO and the US and the UK to project power. If you're the reason that Ukraine's become this cause célèbre and we have Ukrainian flags is because we're at war with Russia, a Cold War, but we're at war with Russia, and you see it in the media as well, you know, constantly. The invasion of Ukraine was a criminal act, and it's been barbaric what's been happening there, but it's just the fact that we're not in the business of morality in our government, and most governments around the world aren't. So, and you look at the campaigns that like Darfur and Coney and all these ones, there's campaigns that become huge in the media, humanizing black people who are victims of certain things, but it's got to be in the interests of powerful forces to be, and their ability to project power. And even a good example is Malala, right? Who was that, what was awful what happened to her, but she was promoted massively and became this global celebrity because it was in the interests of powerful forces in the West to show this heroic girl, which she is, who got shot by the Taliban. Like there's many. I've been in Latin America in places where you have many people mutilated, shot by US-backed and UK-backed dictatorships and regimes that no one's ever heard of. No journalist has even asked them a question ever, but that's because it's not in anyone's interests, and the media takes its priorities from the state. So that I think that's maybe a bigger reason. But obviously racism plays a role, but then also many of the worst journalists who do the same thing are not white anyway. And the same with politicians. Look at the Rishi Sunak was the prime minister when we were participating in a genocide. He's not white. So I think that it is a bit of a error to make it all about race, because obviously it plays a factor, but the way that society operates, they don't really care. Like they'll use anyone if it helps them project power. So that's my take.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much for adding that value to this question. The last question I have, and we'll keep it a little bit brief, but I wanted to just give you all a couple of minutes just to answer this question. So the Green Party has passed motions calling it a genocide, Israel as an apartheid state, prescribing the IDF, and there is a draft motion going to Spring Conference for calling Zionism as racism. If you could choose, what other motions would you like to see the Green Party pass? And I'll go to each speaker for this question, starting with Karishma.
I mean, honestly, the bar politically is in the floor, and the Green Party is already doing remarkably well around this. So I'm not sure. I don't know exactly what I would. Let me have a think. Can we go to one of the others first?
We'll come back to you, Karishma.
Can I take a second? There are a million things I would want to ask for. Go on.
Absolutely. Let's start with you, Harriet.
Sorry, I'll just unmute myself. I guess just sort of off the back of Matt's response to my answer there, which was incredibly pertinent, and I was like, wow, I just totally fell into the trap of like ascribing it all to race when actually it's about power. So maybe the Green Party should pass a motion to do with us not getting into any more conflicts in terms of like the support of allies. So we're not going to do what the US does. We're not going to be a vassal satellite state of American foreign policy interests. Something to do with that. That's what I'd like to see from the Green Party.
Common security. I like it. Matt, over to you.
Yeah, one of them was going to be what Harriet said. Like, there's a whole world which is not covered, which going back to what was mentioned about propaganda by omission, and that's the fact that we are just a property of the United States, and we are occupied by 12,000 US troops. The CIA and NSA, which is another intelligence agency and surveillance agency, run or fund 50% of the funding for some of our own intelligence sites comes from those American agencies, and they have huge amounts of personnel stocked throughout the UK, including 1,000 CIA personnel allegedly at RAF Croughton. I would say pass a motion to say we want to kick out all the US troops and US spies, which Charles de Gaulle did, by the way, in the 1960s. So it's possible. And Charles de Gaulle wasn't a leftist, as we know. So I think this is a really important issue, and it's becoming more and more important because of Trump. Or I actually think it's been important for a long time, but Trump's really alienated, obviously, the sort of liberal classes who have often been the main constituency for the American empire and its role in the UK, and they're kind of cleaving away now. So it's a good time to first accentuate and reveal and expose and talk about the US occupation, but also to call for it to end. So that's one. The other one I would do, and this probably won't happen, but I understand why, but I think it should, is like a call for anti-Zionism, because the debate needs to be moved on as well from genocide and everything we've seen, because obviously it needs to end. But I also think like we need to talk about the bigger issue, because even if there is a two-state solution, which is impossible and Israel's never going to let it happen, but even if there was, that you'd still agree with a Jewish supremacist state in the 68 borders, which is, I don't agree, I'm not an ethno-supremacist. I don't agree with that principle. I don't think any race or religion should have a state where they have the indigenous people have to be a constant minority, which is what even Israel and 67 borders. So I think there should be a anti-Zionist motion, and it's basic progressivism. There's nothing progressive about Zionism. They imposed a colony on top of indigenous people. Vast majority of them were indigenous, and then put them into these little Bantu stands in the West Bank, and then a concentration camp in Gaza for decades and decades. It can't. There's no justification for that on any progressive grounds. So we should call. I believe the left should call, and it's. This won't happen, but because there's so much propaganda put up about it that people think it's like anti-Semitic or whatever. But the point is, we need to flip the conversation and say, no, we're not anti-Semitic, we're anti-racist, and we don't agree with states and indigenous people being constantly suppressed and held in concentration camps. So there should be a call to dismantle Israel and have equal rights for everyone between the river and the sea, Palestinian, Jewish, Israeli. Have a democratic state, which is how we're told, which is what we're told we're meant to believe in. But I think we really need to mainstream anti-Zionism, because it's never gonna. This is not gonna end until Zionism is demolished, and it deserves to be demolished. To be honest, it's been a nightmare from the start.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. One single democratic state between the river and the sea with equal rights for all. Lastly, back over to Karishma. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, and I entirely agree with both Harriet and Matt. I think actually one of the things that I remember talking to a few other Green Party members about, because I joined fairly recently, I think we were talking actually about media-related policy, or the sort of media-related policy that the Greens could have, and potentially turning, or like advocating for turning the BBC into more of a mutual organization, a more democratically led one, a more representative one. I think I would like to see some really well-thought media policy that might prevent some of the things that we have been talking about today. I don't know if that is... I don't know if that's something that is already in the works or that is happening. Somebody please feel free to tell me if that's the case. But I would really like to see that proper media reform. If the Greens had power, what would they do to make somewhere like the BBC better? Because I mean, I want us to have strong public service organizations. I don't want them to be beholden to the state. I want to see proper reform. And there are some brilliant people, for example, Dr. Tom Mills, Des Friedman, lots of different media professors who've got brilliant policy ideas around this. And I think the Green Party could incorporate them.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, all. I think we'll call it there. I'd like all of you to extend a massive thank you to all of our speakers for coming in and giving such great presentations and for answering your questions. Thank you all for joining, and have a great rest of your evening, everybody. Solidarity to all. Free Palestine.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.